some other propositions that would be incompatible with P. So an example that Lemnos uses is if you might be said to know that a thief named Smith has robbed the bank, but if you are to know that Smith has robbed the bank, then you need to be able to exclude the possibility that somebody else, Jones, robbed the bank. If you can't exclude the possibility that it was Jones that did it, then you don't know that Smith did it. And the rough thought is that in order to know a proposition to be true, there are going to be some incompatible propositions that you have to know to be false. Otherwise, the thought is that you wouldn't know that original proposition to be true. And this thought that you need to be able to exclude, rule out some propositions, Lemnos expresses in terms of a principle that he calls the principle of exclusion. So this is PE, what he calls the principle of exclusion. And it's that S, some knowing subject, knows that P, some proposition, only if S can rule out, and that means know to be false, any proposition S knows to be incompatible with P. So I guess in the previous case, if Smith knows, if you know that if it were Jones who robbed the bank, that would be incompatible with Smith having robbed the bank, you'd need to be able to know that Jones didn't rob the bank in order to know that Smith robbed the bank. You're supposed to be able to exclude certain possibilities, certain propositions that you know to be incompatible with what you're claiming to know. You need to be able to know them to be false. Now, sort of sticking with kind of a Morean background to this, Lemnos works with the proposition H, and I'll be, right through this lecture, we'll be working with H, and just try to remember that H is for hands, right? H is the proposition, I have hands, okay? So he considers the proposition that I have hands, okay, H. Now, according to the principle of exclusion, there's going to be some propositions that we're going to need to be able to rule out in order to know that I have hands, in order to know that H. And examples of incompatible alternatives are, I have hooks instead of hands, right? I don't have hands, I have hooks, right? Hooks instead of hands. Or that I don't have any hands, right? I'm a handless. I have no hands. That's an alternative to H. Or I have lobster claws instead of hands. I got claws instead of hands. These are alternatives to H, right? I have hands, and there are some incompatible alternatives. Now, it's possible to rule these alternatives out, right? You can look. I look and I see I have hands, I see that they're not hooks, and I don't have lobster claws. You're able to rule out certain of these incompatible propositions. So in claiming to know H, there are some propositions that you can rule out simply by gathering some information, making an observation. So for a proposition like H, I have hands, there are a number of propositions that are incompatible with H that we can rule out by looking, right? But there's going to be some propositions that we can't rule out just by gathering further information, just by observing, just by making an observation. And what the obvious example of this are going to be the skeptical scenarios, right? Skeptical hypotheses are going to be such that we're not able to rule them out by observation. So I can rule out that I don't have hands. I can rule out that I have hooks instead of hands by looking, but there are going to be some other kinds of propositions that are incompatible with I have hands, which we're not going to be able to rule out just by looking. So now we have to bear in mind that H is I have hands, and now let's have V. V I'm going to use throughout the lecture. This is Lemnos' V. V is for that, I take it, right? So here's a skeptical hypothesis, skeptical proposition that's incompatible with H. I am a handless, right? That tells you I don't have hands. I'm a handless brain in a vat, being caused to have perceptual experiences as if I have hands, okay? V is, it seems, incompatible with H. If V is true, then it's not true that I have hands, right? If I'm a handless brain in a vat, then I don't have hands. I don't have a body because I'm a brain in the vat, and I don't have hands because I don't have a body, and hands are typically attached to bodies, and I don't have either, right? So V is incompatible with H. So we got these two propositions, V, I have hands, and, sorry, H, I have hands, and V, I am a brainless, sorry, I am a handless brain in a vat. I'm a brainless brain. I'm a handless brain in a vat being caused to have perceptual experiences as if I have hands. And the worry is that you can't rule out the skeptical proposition V by gathering some information. But principle E has told us that we must be able to rule V out, or rule out propositions incompatible with H in order to know H. And so that then suggests that we don't know that we have hands. And this is the raw material for what Lemos calls the argument from ignorance. Two premises. First is you know that you have hands only if you know that you're not a handless brain in a vat, caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. Second premise. But you don't know that you're not a handless brain in a vat, caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. So you don't know you have hands. Right? You don't know you're not a handless brain in the vat. You needed to know you're not a handless brain in the vat, so you don't know that you have hands. And that Lemos calls the argument from ignorance. A couple things to notice about the argument. It uses the principle of exclusion. It uses the principle that you need to exclude certain propositions that are incompatible with what you know or what you claim to know in order to know it. So it turns on the principle of exclusion. The second is it uses the skeptical scenario V, the brain in the vat scenario, but it could use another skeptical scenario. It just happens to be working with that one, right? You can run the argument through with other kinds of similar scenarios. Now, there's different ways of responding to the argument from ignorance. We're going to be looking at effectively three today. But the one I want to start with, this is what Lemos does, is what would be a Morean response to the argument from ignorance? Well, More is going to take the view that we know we have hands. And since we know we have hands, skepticism must be wrong. The skeptical scenario is going to rest on assumptions that are more problematic than the mere thought that we have hands. And so Moore is going to reject the argument from ignorance by not denying that we do not know that V is false, right? So up in there, you do not know that you're not a handless brain in a vat caused to have perceptual experience as if you have hands. So premise 2 is you don't know that V is false. Well, that's what Moore is going to challenge. This is sort of the Moorean counter-argument. You know that H, you have hands. You know that you have hands only if you know that it's not the case that you're a handless brain in a vat caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. Second premise, this is the Moorean premise. You know you have hands, right? So you know that it's not the case that you're a handless brain in a vat caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. So the response to the argument from ignorance is we know we have hands, so the skeptical scenario can be rejected. The Moorean response is one way to respond to the argument from ignorance. But there's a couple of other ways that I want to work through. The second way is what is often called the relevant alternatives theory, or the relevant alternative account or approach. It is going to effectively deny that we have to be able to exclude all hypotheses incompatible with what we claim to know. So if we claim to know that I have a hand, we don't actually have to exclude all hypotheses, all propositions that are incompatible with it. So the principle of exclusion has said we need to be able to exclude, need to be able to show to know to be false any proposition that's incompatible with some proposition P. So H, for example, if there's a proposition that we know to be incompatible with H, with I have hands, we need to be able to show it to be false. But the relevant alternative theorist says that's not necessary. We don't need to be able to exclude all alternatives that we know to be incompatible with the proposition we claim to know. We just need to be able to exclude the relevant alternatives. So for ordinary circumstances, when we make claims to know something, we don't have to be able to exclude skeptical alternatives, right? So if I claim to know that I have a hand, I don't have to exclude the brain in the vat hypothesis. That's not a relevant alternative. The skeptical scenarios are not relevant alternatives to the claim to know that I have a hand. It's not a relevant alternative that perhaps I'm a brain in the vat who doesn't have hands. And we just don't pay attention. We don't consider relevant alternatives. We don't have to exclude them. We don't have to show them to be false. This idea had a number of advocates, but the person who I think is most well known for advocating is a philosopher named Fred Dretske. I'm going to give you a quote now. He has a couple of examples of things that we don't need to be able to exclude. So we suppose that this wall were painted red, but we look at it, we know it's painted red, but we don't have to rule out the possibility that it's actually white, but there's a special light illuminating it to make it look red. Or if you go to the zoo and you see some zebras, you know they're zebras, but they could be mules that are painted to look like zebras, but you don't have to have ruled that out in order to know that they're zebras. So here's Dretske. What I'm suggesting is that we simply admit that we do not know that some of these contrasting skeptical alternatives are not the case, but refuse to admit that we do not know what we originally said we knew. By knowing that the wall is red certainly entails that the wall is red. It also entails that the wall is not white, and in particular entails that the wall is not white cleverly illuminated to look red. It does not follow from the fact that I know that the wall is red that I know that it's not white cleverly illuminated to look red. Right? You don't need to know that that alternative is false. Nor does it follow from the fact that I know that those animals are zebras, that I know that they are not mules cleverly disguised that look like zebras. So you've gone to a zoo, you looked at some zebras. There is a hypothesis, there is an alternative to the claim that there was zebras, namely that they're mules cleverly disguised that look like zebras. And you don't have to know that that's false in order to know that you were looking at zebras. You don't have to have excluded some irrelevant alternatives. You should only be considering relevant alternatives. So this Dretskian quote is a kind of a classic example of the relevant alternatives account. The thought is that we don't have to be able to know the truth of all of the consequences of some particular thing we know. We look at zebras. We believe that we're looking at zebras. If they're zebras, right, if it's true that the things that I'm looking at are zebras, then it follows from that, given that they're zebras, that they're not mules cleverly disguised to look like zebras. And that's something that follows from the claim that those are zebras. But the thought is you don't actually have to know that that's false. You don't have to sort of know, in a sense, all of the things that follow from what you know. You don't actually have to know those things. There's a kind of a principle here that people have thought is obvious that the relevant alternatives approach is going to reject. It's usually called a closure principle. The closure principle means that, so take whatever claim you're considering, like H, I have hands, there are going to be some consequences of that claim. And you might find it intuitive to think that if you know H, and there are some logical consequences of H, then you also know those logical consequences. Because you might think if you know H, and there's something else which is going to be true if H is true, then you must also know that. that might seem to be an intuitive principle, but and this is what's usually called closure. They use the expression that that it's closed under entailment. So you know H or you know P, and then you know the things that follow from it. Well, Tversky is effectively rejecting the idea that you know what follows from the particular things that you know, or that you know all of the things that follow from them. Right? So this is relative alternative. The relative alternative theory is said to reject a principle of closure. It's said to reject the idea that knowledge is closed under entailment. Now, what then does the relevant alternatives approach say about the skeptical scenarios? So we've got H, which is I have hands, and we have V, which is I am a brain in a vat without hands, being caused to think that I have hands. What's the relevant alternative response going to be the skeptical scenario? Well, V is not a relevant alternative to H. Being a brain in a vat without hands is not a relevant alternative to H, I have hands. And so we don't have to know that it's false. And the thought is, you could still know that you have hands. I can know H, even if I don't know that it's false that I'm a brain in a vat, right? You can know H without knowing that V is false. That's what the relevant alternatives theorist is going to say. Now, a couple problems for the relevant alternative theorist. The first is really this question of how we're going to determine what's relevant. How do you determine whether V is or is not relevant to H? Maybe what you do is say, look, anything that is like a, anything that would make it the case that I don't know that I have hands is an irrelevant alternative, so we won't consider them. I mean, maybe that's how we're going to disregard any incompatible proposition that would make it the case that I don't know that I have hands. Well, that just looks a little bit ad hoc. It looks like what you do is you invent the idea of relevant alternatives, irrelevant alternatives, and then you just put to one side any skeptical scenarios. Not obvious that that's well motivated. So there's this question as to how you're going to determine what is a relevant and what's not a relevant alternative. Another worry is what's called the objection from the abominable conjunction, right? The problem with the relevant alternative hypothesis, or a relevant alternative approach, they've said that you can know that you have hands. And at the same time, you don't have to know that it's false that you're brain in the vat, right? Because that's not a relevant alternative. Well, what this then means is that there's a conjunction of two things, two propositions, and this conjunction, these two things which are going to be true at the same time, they are conjoined. These two things seem like you really shouldn't be conjoining them. So you could know that you have hands and not know that you're not a brain in the vat, right? I don't know that it's false that V, I'm not a handless brain in the vat. And these two would then be conjoined. So it's the relevant alternativist theorist seems to be saying you can both know that you have hands and not know that you are not a brain in the vat without hands. And it looks like the relevant alternativist theorist is saying that both of those you can maintain at the same time. But you would have thought there's a sense in which if this is true, then the other isn't, right? If you don't know that it's false that you're a brain in the vat, then how can you know that you have hands? The relevant alternative theorist seems to be saying you can endorse both of those claims. And that's what they call the abominable conjunction. You should be ruling one of them out, not keeping both in. So the story is that out of the relevant alternatives approach grew an approach that's often nowadays called the contextualist approach. And the contextualist argues that there is a way in which our word know, our word knowing, knowledge, has a sensitivity to the context in which we're going to be attributing knowledge to an agent. Knowledge, knowing, is context sensitive. It's sensitive to conditions in which we're going to be asserting or ascribing knowledge. And roughly, I mean, there's going to be different kind of contexts, but crudely, there's going to be ordinary contexts, ordinary everyday contexts, in which standards that are, in a sense, I would say low. I don't know if this is what the contextualist wants to say, but low standards operate and govern our use of the word know. So in ordinary everyday contexts, we do say that we know things. But then there are other contexts which are higher contexts, or which are not ordinary contexts, in which somehow the standards that are appropriate have shifted, and now higher standards are employed. And in those contexts, we no longer know, right? So ordinary contexts, there are low standards, and we have knowledge. These other contexts, the standards have become higher, and it's no longer right that we have knowledge. Now, I want to illustrate this with a couple of cases that are given by Keith DeRose. I have a paper in the reader from Keith DeRose, but this case actually comes from another article. But these are cases in which I think it's a crucial feature of these two cases that the evidence available is exactly the same. There is no change in the evidence that's made available to the person who's either saying that they know or don't know something. What's changed is, in a sense, the stakes, how important or urgent or crucial it is, or whether it's really important that you know something. There's this, what sort of hangs on it is more important in one case than the other. And this is what leads to it being appropriate to use the word know in one circumstance and not the other. These are cases in which the question is whether a bank is open on Saturday morning. So this is the first case. This is a sort of, I would call this the low standards case, the normal case. My wife and I are driving home on a Friday afternoon. We plan to stop at the bank on the way home to deposit our paychecks. But as we drive past the bank, we notice that the lines inside are very long, as they often are on Friday afternoons. Although we generally like to deposit our paychecks as soon as possible, it's not especially important in this case that they be deposited right away. So I suggest that we drive straight home and deposit our paychecks on Saturday morning. My wife says, maybe the bank won't be open tomorrow. Lots of banks are closed on Saturdays. I reply, no, I know it'll be open. I was just there 2 weeks ago on Saturday. It's open until noon. So they're driving home. They need to deposit a check. Nothing particularly important hangs on when the check is deposited. He saw that he was in the bank 2 weeks ago. It was open, so he has evidence that the bank's open Saturday morning, right? And it seems perfectly appropriate for him to say, I know the bank is open on Saturdays. Slightly different case. Same scenario with a bit of a difference. My wife and I drive past the bank on a Friday afternoon, as in case A, and notice the long lines. I again suggest that we deposit our paychecks on Saturday morning, explaining that I was at the bank on Saturday morning only 2 weeks ago and discovered that it was open until noon. But in this case, we've just written a very large and very important check. If our paychecks are not deposited into our checking account before Monday morning, the important check we wrote will bounce, leaving us in a very bad situation. And of course, the bank is not open on Sunday. My wife reminds me of these facts. She then says, banks do change their hours. Do you know the bank will be open tomorrow? He says, remaining as confident as I was before that the bank will be open, still I reply, well, no, I better go in and make sure. Same evidence available to him, but what hangs on it is much more important. It's much more urgent that they be able to deposit the check on Saturday morning. And now he doesn't think it's appropriate to insist that he knows. Now the context has shifted slightly, and he doesn't say that he knows. And he better go and find out whether it's open. And yet in the previous case, same evidence available, seemed appropriate to say that he knew. Now, You may or may not sort of like the way this works, but the thought is you may, in sort of ordinary use of the word know, find that slight adjustments of context might make you say that you do or do not know something. The difference in these cases is not with respect to the evidence available, right? I think this is important. You might think that's the only important thing for knowledge. That doesn't seem to be what's important. What's important is the stakes, what's at stake. I don't know whether all contextualist examples work with that contrast, but at least this one seems to be working with the fact that there is something practical, something of practical importance that hangs in the balance. And that is determining whether one ought to be using the word know or not. Does this matter? Well, DeRose thinks this is important. And what he thinks is that there are different contexts. These contexts are such that it's appropriate to use the word know in the first case because in that context, the stakes are not high. And so the standards can be lower, or the standards can be sort of more everyday sort of standards. But in the second case, it's more important to be able to make the right choice. And now the standards that are appropriate to use of the word know are higher. And so he knows in the first case, but it's not the case that he knows in the second case. That wasn't a case of skepticism, right? Those were two perfectly ordinary cases that could happen. And the word know, if the contextualist is right, is sensitive to shift in ordinary cases. Well, what about skepticism? Skepticism, the skeptic will be altering the context. We'll ordinarily say, here's a hand and I know this is a hand. But the minute we start talking about skepticism, we've shifted the context. And a different set of standards have come into play now. It was perfectly right to say that I knew I have hands in an ordinary context. But once we start thinking about the skeptic, ordinary standards are no longer appropriate. Now a different set of standards has come into play, sort of a higher set of standards. So here's DeRose. According to contextual analysis, when the skeptic presents her arguments, she manipulates various conversational mechanisms that raise the semantic standards for knowledge, and thereby creates a context in which she can truly say that we know nothing or very little. But the fact that the skeptic can thus install very high standards which we don't live up to has no tendency to show that we don't satisfy the more relaxed standards that are in place in ordinary conversations. Skeptically generated contexts are ones in which we don't have knowledge. Ordinary contexts, different standards apply, and we do. So what I want to do now is look at how these three approaches that we've now looked at sort of deal with the same sort of topic, how they deal with the argument from ignorance. So remember the argument from ignorance? Basically, you don't know you're not a brain in the vat, so you don't know here's a hand, right? You know you have hands only if you know that you are not a handless brain in the vat caused to have a perceptual experience if you have hands. So the only way you're going to know that you have hands is if you know that you're not a brain in the vat. But you don't know you're not a handless brain in the vat caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. You don't know you're not a brain in the vat, so you don't know you have hands. That's the argument from ignorance. We saw that the Morean insists that we know we have hands. Given that they know we have hands, they reject the skeptical hypothesis. So effectively, the Morean is rejecting that second premise. But you do not know that you're not a handless brain in a vat caused as if you have hands, right? The Morean is rejecting that. Morean thinks that we do know that we have hands. Relevant alternative theorist. Well, they're going to object to the argument from ignorance. but not in the same way that the Morean does. The relevantist thinks that you can know that the relativist thinks that you don't need to be able to show that V is false, right? That you're not a brain in the vat in order to know that you have hands. So the relevantist doesn't think that you need to accept the first premise. So the first premise is you know that you have hands only if you know that you're not a handless brain in a vat caused to have perceptual experiences if you have hands. The relevant alternativist theorist doesn't agree to that. Doesn't agree that you need to be able to know that you're not a brain in the vat. Relevant alternativist theorist rejects that. What's the contextualist do? Well, the contextualist says that it depends on context, right? Context is a skeptically generated context, then you don't know that you have a hand. But if it's an ordinary context, then you do know, right? So in a sense, the contextualist is going to say that the argument from ignorance is going to sort of, how you approach that is going to depend on which context you're thinking about. Skeptically generated context, you're not going to say that you know you have hands. Ordinary context, you are. What should we say about the contextualist? What the contextualist is trying to do is deal with skepticism by saying, look, the skeptic is on to something. But the skeptic is on to something about peculiar contexts, which aren't normal contexts. And skepticism doesn't really challenge what we do in ordinary contexts. It doesn't undermine our ordinary attributions of knowledge in ordinary contexts. We do have knowledge in those contexts, given the standards that are relevant in those contexts. What the skeptic does is generate or create a different context. And in those contexts, it's not correct to say that we have knowledge. In those contexts, knowledge, in a sense, evaporates or disappears. Well, is that an acceptable response or approach? It looks like the contextualist is trying to reconcile skepticism with ordinary common sense, right? By saying, in ordinary common sense situations, you have knowledge. But in skeptical situations, you don't. And that's because the standards are different. So there's no, in a sense, no kind of contradiction, right? In ordinary context, you can say you have knowledge, but in weird, skeptically generated context, you don't. The problem is that the contextualist is allowing that the skeptic can actually generate a legitimate context. And these standards are, in a sense, higher standards. And it's almost as if ordinary contexts have standards that are sort of too low, too loose, too relaxed. And so there's even, it seems to me, a suggestion that even though they try to reconcile the two contexts, there's a sense in which, ordinary context is perfectly fine to say you know, but those are actually, it's all right to say that according to sloppy standards. You introduce high standards and you won't say you know anymore. So there's a sense in which it seems to suggest that what goes on in ordinary context isn't really up to the best possible standards. And in fact, it seemed, the contextualist is trying to show that it's perfectly genuine, perfectly legitimate to say that we know things, while at the same time conceding to the skeptic that it's perfectly legitimate to say there's certain contexts in which we don't. But it's almost as if this is giving too much to the skeptic, right? This is allowing that the skeptic has actually the capacity to generate legitimate contexts in which we don't know anything. Now, there's going to be philosophers, we already know the Moreans are in this camp, but there's going to be philosophers like fallibilists and naturalists who are going to be looking at in a few weeks, who are going to think, look, the skeptic is making a mistake by trying to set these standards up as high as they do. There just aren't, it's just not appropriate to have such high standards. That's a mistake. The skeptic's making a mistake. And the contextualist isn't saying the skeptic's making a mistake. The contextualist is allowing that the skeptic can actually generate legitimate context with high standards. And the question is whether such standards are appropriate at all, whether, in fact, the contextual, whether the skeptic is able to set up genuine context, legitimate contexts. So there's going to be people who are going to resist contextualism because, in a sense, they're granting too much to skepticism and not defending ordinary standards enough. Just a glance ahead, I'll be moving next time to a topic that Limos doesn't discuss, which is the topic of relativism. I like to discuss it because I see it as being connected to skepticism. I think there are arguments for skepticism that are used to support claims of relativism. And also, relativism has some interesting connections with contextualism. The positions are different, but both relativists and contextualists claim that the standards that are employed in making decisions about what we know are standards that vary with respect to context. So there is something that relativism and contextualism have in common that I think is worth at least exploring. Lots of time for questions tonight. So away you go. Any questions? I will start calling on people. Any worries about contextualism? People attracted to the idea that there are just different contexts and that the skeptic can actually generate a context in which we don't have knowledge. Well, at the same time, there are these other equally genuine contexts in which we employ knowledge, the concept of knowledge. And in those contexts, we do have knowledge.
Wasn't it kind of like saying that you just, like in the ordinary context, you're just saying, we're applying the word know to just believing, and then in the higher context, you just don't know anything, so there's really just no knowledge at all?
I mean, yeah. So take the example of H. I have hands. I know I have hands. In an ordinary circumstance, we'll all agree to that. And the thought is that in ordinary circumstances, there is a kind of set of standards that we would employ, and I assume it's going to be something like, use sense perception. And if in normal lighting conditions you look and it seems as if I have a hand, then you will have arrived at the state of knowing that I have a hand. And that's perfectly appropriate in ordinary contexts. And now, let's consider a skeptical scenario. The skeptical scenario on the table is, I'm a brain in a vat without hands, and I have no way of showing that I'm not, because we've designed that scenario in such a way that it's consistent with all the possible experience we might have. And the skeptic seems to be requiring that we need to be able to show that a claim like a scenario like that doesn't exist, but we're not able to do that because of the way it's been set up. And now the thought is, in order for us to know, we'd have to be able to prove that such scenarios don't apply. And in ordinary context, we didn't have to do that. Somehow now the standards have lifted up. We've got to be able to prove that things like the brain in a vat scenario is false. And the contextualist is saying, well, that's a different kind of context. In that context, it's appropriate to apply the standard which requires us to show that such scenarios don't exist. And in those circumstances, in those contexts, we don't have knowledge. And then the thought is that the word know is a kind of word that works differently in different contexts. And in that context, these other standards kicked in. But in this context, there are these other standards. I've got Nick, and then I've got Kieran. Yeah, and then Paul. But so the worry about the contextualist, though, is, why grant that the skeptic has actually generated a genuine context in which we don't have knowledge? The contextualist seems, right, their move is to say, look, the word knowledge is contextually sensitive. But their move also seems to be suggesting that the skeptic actually is able to shift the standards that are appropriate. So it seems to go rather a long way with the skeptic. Nick, then Kieran, then Paul.
Does contextualism then necessitate the truth is relative? Because if knowledge is relative in context and knowledge is justified true belief, then doesn't that mean the truth will also follow suit?
So one way of going for the contextualist, and this will be part of the content of saying that the word know is context sensitive, is that in fact different propositions are being asserted. So that in the ordinary context, when you say you know you have a hand, there's one thing that's being asserted. And in the other context, when you say you don't know you have a hand, and that looks like it contradicts I know I have a hand, and that, in fact, another proposition is being asserted. Another proposition is being asserted because the word know is sensitive to different standards in that context. And I think that would be the way they would try. So the relativist is going to say something like, P is true in this context and not P is true in that one. And that looks like the classic problem with truth relativism is it gets you kind of a contradiction. So one way a contextualist can go is to say, actually something different is being asserted. So what looks like attention isn't really attention. Or another way of going, and I think this is closer to your point, would be not to make that semantic move, but to say that the standards are different. So it's going to be, in this context, it was the claim is justified given these standards and true. But then over here, it's other standards, and it looks like it's no longer true. So there it is looking like it's going to be, the truth is varying. So to avoid that kind of relativism, I think they have to go the semantic sort of way. But there are connections I see between relativism and contextualism, at least worth sort of trying to sort through the relationship. A lot of people tend to think that contextualism isn't sort of as objectionable as classic relativism. It was Kieran next and then Paul. I can't remember anybody else. Yeah.
I had a similar question to Nick. I was just thinking with those initial examples with the zebra and the red wall, you said that they can legitimately say they know it's not a mule. No, they can say they know it's a zebra even though they're not certain that it's not a mule painted or disguised.
Yeah.
Is that taking truth away from knowledge? Does knowledge then become just justified belief?
Right. So that's going to be, I mean, maybe the contextualist does talk about that example, but at that point I was talking about Dretski's move, the relevant alternative view, which isn't a contextualist view yet. And so what Dretski's thinking is you can know that P without sort of knowing something that you might think is connected with P. And take the zebra example. You're looking at some zebras and you form the belief that what you're looking at are zebras. And let's assume that they are zebras. So it's true that they're zebras, and you're justified in believing it's true. And so it looks like you've got justified true belief. But then there was this thought that you need to be able to exclude a proposition that was incompatible with the belief that they're zebras. And as an example of an incompatible proposition, there's the statement, they're not zebras, they're mules that have been cleverly disguised to be zebras. And the relevant alternative is, well, you might think you need to have excluded that in order to actually know. But you haven't sort of excluded this, so if you haven't excluded it somehow, how do you know it if you haven't excluded this other alternative, right? And the thought is, well, it's true that, if these are zebras, then they're not mules cleverly disguised to be zebras, and you should be able to exclude that, but the thought is, you don't have to have excluded it because it's not a relevant alternative. Right?
If there were mules, though, would Dretski say it's knowledge?
No, because if they're mules, then your belief would be false. right?
The
So,
truth is still necessary.
that's right, yeah. My understanding is if they're mules, then, so the idea is they are zebras.
Yeah.
But you haven't excluded the possibility that they're mules because you didn't regard that as a relevant alternative. But they are zebras, and so it's true. If they had been mules, you'd have a false belief. But so the thought is, even where it's a true belief, you ought. The prior thought was you needed to exclude hypotheses that were incompatible with it. And Dresky says, no, you don't have to exclude the irrelevant possibilities. Mules disguised as zebras is an irrelevant possibility, presumably. But so is the brain of the bat hypothesis. And you don't have to. But then the objection that the contextualist makes is that then lands you with asserting both, I know that I know that here's a hand, and I don't know I'm not a brain in the bat. And it looks like there's some kind of contradiction there.
As it's been presented, the contextualist position seems to be just a bit inadequate. I mean, to me it was a bit disappointing to say that really the big change is standards go higher in those different contexts. But
right.
I would have thought the real argument around contextualism is relating to the way we normally behave. Like, sometimes the question might be about the veridicality of the zebras. That might actually be the key question. And there might be a context in which we're really wanting to probe that particular question. So rather than the standards changing in different sceptical contexts, surely you'd be trying to nail down, what are the current most key questions as part. It seems to me that sometimes also the sceptical argument might in fact be the key question that you're asking. So you might be asking not about the fact that I've got a hand here, but the fact that it's really sort of like a symbol for, do we know anything about the external world? And suddenly with the question around the sceptical argument becomes very relevant. And I would have thought that's the big debate about context. Setting the question within the world that you're really asking the question, and saying these are the parameters of it, and then you can have your debate, and then people will see that your standard's going to be appropriate to that.
Couple things. One, I certainly like the idea that there are specific questions that are asked in specific contexts, and it could really be the case that we're interested in whether those are zebras or mules. And that's, this is something I've mentioned in the toot you're in, but I don't think in the other toot. It often seems as if the skeptic gets a free ride. The skeptic is permitted to ask whatever question they want. But questioning usually has a rationale, a motivation. There's something you're interested in finding out about. And you typically ask something when there's something we genuinely are doubtful of, rather than just always being able to question everything. And so I think there's something a little bit strange about how skepticism simply seems to be the kind of thing that happens where you just ask, you generate a doubt about every claim you make. Whereas what really seems to happen is you have quite specific doubts about a particular view, right? And it might be, look, we know that there were people who've disguised zebras around here. And we really better check to disguised mules. And we really better check. I remember reading somewhere in the Middle East, there was actually a zoo where
Had dogs for lions.
Right. So we know, right, in a context like that, right, you're about to pay your entrance fee, and you think, okay, I want to make sure this is a zoo where you see lions rather than dogs, right? In that context, the question is a genuine question, right? Whereas the general question, to be able to ask for any particular claim you make, do we really know it? That seems a different sort of thing. So I think that much I think is right. The other thing, about context, well, I guess it's just that there can be different things that are called contextualism, and this is what these contextualists have tried to do. I think probably as a first move to tightening up the relevant alternatives idea, to try to, how do you figure out which alternatives are relevant or not? And the thought might be, well, in some contexts, some things are relevant, in some contexts they're not. and then started to think, well, look, we might come up with some cases where really it looks like in this context you'd want to say you know, and in another context you wouldn't want to say you know when, I mean, what was kept constant between the two bank examples is that the evidence didn't change. And normally in epistemology you're thinking that justified true belief, evidence is going to be the only thing. Here we have what looks like a kind of practical consideration that was upping the ante a little bit. So made it the case that even though the evidence was the same, one wasn't so confident using the word no in that second context. And that's the kind of thing that these people have been pointing to. But there's all sorts of contextualisms in philosophy, so different things that we can be contextualist about. Okay, so we'll move on. Next week I'll be talking about relativism, then it's going to be the a priori, and then I'll be talking about naturalism, and then before long we'll be out of limos and into these two sections of particular topics that I want to work on. Have a nice 5 days. Oh, and essays next week. If you need extensions, get in touch with me beforehand.
Thank you.
No, I think extensions are that easier. Like this one from Boston, and I got essays and then got extensions.
Where's Fairfield?
About the,
Where's Fairfield?
Connecticut.
Connecticut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I talk to you about the essays?
Yeah.
I'm not really kind of new to philosophy and stuff, so
Yep.
I don't really know what you want as far as
Like him. Thank you.
like, do you want us to do more like of a research type thing, or is it supposed to be more like your own ideas?
Right, so it's sort of a combination. You need to sort of do research
Yeah.
and write about. So in this first essay, it's going to be fairly easy to pick bits of the limos on the reader where there's relevant things to sort of study.
Right.
It's good to read a little bit extra.
Yeah.
And so your essay should sort of be grounded primarily in that, but not just an exposition. In a philosophy essay, we're typically looking for you to try to develop your own argument, but not sort of, I mean, originality is great, but not so original that doesn't even come in contact, right? So you're going to be, if it's about Getty, you're going to talk about Getty, or you're going to talk about some responses to it. But then instead of just sort of reporting everything you've read, you try to figure out some way of arguing for what you think is the, it doesn't even matter if you think, right? What you think is the right response. Sometimes you find you really don't know what you think, but it's still good to try to sort of go for some kind of a conclusion.
Yeah.
And so that's where you sort of figure out what you think.
Okay.
But focus on arguing rather than sort of just saying, I think.
Yeah.
Right, so you want the grounds for, it's good for you to show what you think to be the case, but provide your reasons for it.
Yeah, so it is more like, kind of like a persuasive kind of...
Try to be, persuasive, but not sort of rhetorically persuasive,
Yeah.
not merely just sort of making
Yeah, I
quick
just wasn't
points.
sure if it was more like a research type paper where I'd do like, in like my other classes.
So
and you,
I want research, but,
Yeah,
the
but
second,
not-
I'm thinking of the second one as being more research.
yeah.
The second is the one where I'm thinking you're gonna go off and you're gonna need to bring in stuff over and above what I've
Okay.
put in the
Yeah,
text.
yeah.
This is really sort of trying to get clear in your own mind about some of these kind of topics we've been thinking about.
Okay.
And just, I mean, one of the great things that philosophers are always emphasizing is trying to be clear. Trying to be clear and try to have, structured. It's good to have an outline where you sort of, know what you're going to do, what needs to be done before something. Try to go step by step.
Okay, perfect.
Okay? And I'll
Thanks.
try to give you some
And is
helpful
there any
feedback.
kind of like referencing bibliography?
Okay,
thing that
so
you like?
There's a lot of, so we don't have a required style.
Mhm.
What we usually say is take some standard style and use it,
And use it just the
and
whole
use it
way.
consistently.
Yeah.
But I do have a qualification. There is a standard style that doesn't have page references, and I just can't see how that helps.